Welcome to the USA Today Network Forum on Native American mascots, nicknames, and logos. I'm David Mckay Wilson, the Tax Watch columnist for the Journal News, lowhud.com, in the Lower Hudson Valley. We're here tonight to discuss an issue that has come to the fore in the summer of Black Lives Matter, with a renewed examination of race-based mascots in New York public schools. The forum is part of a statewide effort by the USA Today Network to look at the issue, where 50 schools still have Native American mascots and an additional 30 have teams that call themselves warriors, with some of those using Native American imagery in their logo. On the national level, we just saw the Washington, D.C. NFL team retire the Redskins. Here in the Hudson Valley, change is underway as well. John Jay Cross River High School replaced its Indian in July with the Wolves. The Nyack School Board voted on Tuesday to retire Nyack High's Indian. And the Wappingers Central School Board says it's open to replacing its Indian mascot, though no decision has been made. Only the Mayapack district in Putnam County in the Lower Hudson Valley has stood firm behind its Indian and its logo, which features a primitive spear with a feather attached. The district has refused to hold a community discussion on the issue. These discussions have taken place for decades at colleges, state universities, and high schools around the country. Many national organizations have called for the end of Native American mascots, including the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association, the National Congress of American Indians, the NAACP, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. In 2019, the state of Maine became the first state to ban Native American mascots. I'd like to welcome our panel this evening from across the country and in the Hudson Valley. Heather Bruegl, Cultural Affairs Director of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohegans, one of 573 federally recognized tribes, which includes Hudson Valley's Wappingers among its peoples. Nicholas Willis of Cedar City, Utah, a member of the Native American Guardians Association. Professor Laurel Davis-Delano, Professor of Sociology at Springfield College, and lead author of the June 2020 paper, The Psychosocial Effects of Native American Mascots, a comprehensive review of empirical research findings. Jacqueline Keeler of Portland, Oregon, founder of a group called Eradicating Offensive Native Mascotry. Dan Ehrenpreis, a 2012 graduate of Mayapack High School, who for the past several months has attempted in vain to open up a community dialogue in Mayapack on the mascot issue. There's two other people who we're hoping will join us later. Alicia Stardancer of Putnam County, who favors the mascot, and Mike Mongan, president of the Mayapack Central School District Board of Education. We'll start our discussion tonight with Heather Bruegl, a member of the Oneida Nation, whose grandmother was from the family of Daniel Nimham, the last Wappinger sachem who fought on the side of the American militia against the British and died in the Battle of Kingsbridge in 1778. Putnam County's highest peak is named for Nimham. And he was a great American who contested the deed that transferred the Wappingers' lands to August Phillips. And he went to England on a diplomatic venture in the 1760s, attempting to overturn the deed, but he was unsuccessful in that. Heather, maybe you can tell us something about the Stockbridge-Munsee Band and how the Wappingers are part of that federally recognized tribe.
Yes, absolutely. First, thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I'm very honored to be here. I just want to clarify, I'm first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. I'm actually enrolled Oneida, yes. But I do work for the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And the Stockbridge-Munsee community, the Stockbridge-Munsee hail from the Mahicanatuck River Valley, which is, you might know it as the Hudson River Valley. We refer to the river as the Mahicanatuck because that's what we've called it for centuries. And that's where we're from. And so we were, we lived in that area. We have interests, historical preservation interests in the Mahicanatuck River Valley, including Dutchess and Putnam counties, where a lot of these battles are heating up. And we have a long and storied history in that area. And one of the things that we know happens is there were a lot of tribes, including the Wappingers, the Pequot, the Brotherton, the Munsee, the Delaware, and the Oneida that joined up with the Stockbridge at the time. And, we traveled together, and the Wappingers, were part of that. And actually, on February 14th of all days, February 14th, 1675, at Albany, which was one of our Mohican council fires, the sachems of the Mohican Nation and the Wappingers met together and joined up together and said, now we're going to become one. We're going to become part of each other. And so that's kind of where our story begins with them, is back in the 1600s.
Uh-huh. Okay. And you have a reservation out in Wisconsin now. Can you tell me something about the reservation there?
Yeah, absolutely. We are on reservation land that was deeded, or not deeded to us, but part of the 1856 treaty that moved us. It was one of our many moves. The 1856 treaty was our final move, and we encompass 2 townships in northeast Wisconsin, and we have been living here since 1856. It's the longest we've been in one area.
Very good. Now, maybe you can talk some about this issue of the mascot. I know your community has dealt with this issue. The president of your tribe, Shannon Holsley, has been outspoken about this with the National Congress of American Indians in the Midwest region. Maybe you can tell me your community's position on this issue.
So we have a tribal resolution that was passed last year that actually states that we stand against the use of race-based mascots, including those of Native Americans, depicted in sports teams or logos, things like that. We have a firm stance against that. And yes, our president, Holsley, has been very outspoken on that issue, along with the National Congress of American Indians. She serves as one of the regional vice presidents on that. And we all know that NCAI stands against that. And so Stockbridge-Munsee stands with that, along with a plethora of other Native organizations that stand against the use of Native Americans as mascots. And we stand strongly against it, which is why we passed a tribal resolution in saying that.
And what are the reasons that you oppose it? These schools that use these mascots say that they're honoring the Wappingers by calling themselves the Indians. Maybe you could talk something to that issue.
Yeah. So we know through what the APA has said that there's issues to using Native Americans as mascots, and one of them is that sometimes there are areas where there aren't many Native Americans in that general area, and so non-Native people hardly ever come in contact with someone who is of Native American ancestry. So the only depictions that they get might be from what you see on sports teams and sports logos. And so that's not an accurate representation of what Native Americans are. I mean, we have a rich and diverse culture in our Native history. It's absolutely beautiful. We also, the APA also states that it undermines the ability of Native nations to accurately portray our history and have respectful images, because we can come out with one thing and then somebody can say, oh, well, that's not what I see on my sports team, or, things like that. You're like what's on the sports logos. It just kind of helps glorify stereotypical images of who Native Americans are. And the NCAI has had a clear position against the derogatory use of Native Americans in film, culture, and school mascots, whether that be at the high school level or at the college level. And people who say that they're honoring it, I would question you to think. I would challenge you to think about, what are you honoring? I think the best way to honor Native nations, instead of reducing a living and breathing and vibrant community down to a mascot, why not teach our history in your schools? And while you're at it and the teaching of it, why not teach, the correct history of us in your schools? And so I would challenge people to say, we're honoring it. You're really not. The best way to honor is through education.
How surprised are you that change has been so slow, and people are still willing to use that argument that we're actually honoring, like you just pointed out?
I find it interesting that we can change so many things throughout the history of the United States. We can change so many things, but we can't seem. People get in an uproar about a football team changing their mascot. Like I honestly want to understand. I really truly do, because I know there are those even in our own Native community that do support that, and I am not belittling anybody's opinion. That is your belief system, and that's great. I wonder why we have such an issue with that. I mean, there are people, it's 2020, and I still run into people who don't realize that Native Americans exist. And it's insane. And yeah, I know, I just saw your eyes get big. Yeah, it's insane. And I guess I really just don't understand, if you're really honoring, have you talked to the tribes that you're supposedly honoring? Have you reached out to the community?
Yes. Now, has the Mahopac School District reached out to your tribe to talk with your tribe about the honoring that they're doing?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and would you like to have some discussion? Would that be something that you'd be interested in engaging with the school district on this?
I mean, if people reach out to us, I am not going to turn down the opportunity to be able to speak and have that open dialogue. I just had a conversation with somebody a couple weeks ago whose school in another part of the country, was wanting to change their mascot, but the school was, or he was a graduate of the school, and he felt that the mascot should stay, but he wanted to educate himself as to, why do people want it to change? Why is it bad? And I had a really good heart-to-heart half-hour conversation with him. And while, he didn't change my mind and I didn't change his mind, he did leave the conversation with him wanting me to send him, some material, and he wanted to learn. So I think if we can just open that dialogue, and from what I understand, there are school districts that don't even want to open that dialogue. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah. James, you've been part of the USA Today Network project that's going to be published online next Wednesday statewide. And maybe you could just talk something about what you've discovered in your research about what school districts are doing across the state. There seems like there's a lot of action right now, a lot of community dialogue going on.
When I first started to take part in the project, I was surprised when you actually do the math that there's still that many schools, school districts, logos out there. I thought after the wave, maybe a wave of change, maybe about at the start of the decade, basically, we wouldn't still have up to maybe a dozen in Section 5 alone. I did receive some education when I got in contact with school district officials at the Salamanca in Section 6. And the story's a little bit different there, but the district is actually on territory belonging to a group of people. So they're not going to change their mascot or logo, because it is so they participated in the discussion from the ground up. Part of the community, the details of the logo, which way the logo faces, the attire of the gentleman in the logo, and so on and so forth. But there's already districts out there who are kind of monitoring New York State bill that want to wipe out all of these logos, or withhold school aid for it. But I mean, to me, it's like you're on borrowed time. You're basically monitoring the progress of this bill to see whether you're going to change now or you're going to change later. I don't know how you can. There aren't too many arguments you can make out loud. Why you would resist changing your logo or nickname if a group of people you're supposedly honoring have a problem with it. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. Laurel, maybe you can talk about your recent study, your review of the literatures, the 19 empirical studies that have been done about the impact of these logos on Native Americans and non-natives. Maybe you could talk about some of the key points of your study, what you found.
Sure. So our article was published in the journal Race, Ethnicity, and Education, and I have two co-authors, Joseph Gahn, from Harvard, and Stephanie Freiberg from University of Michigan. And our premise, as how we start the introduction, is that similar to what's happening right now and happening in schools, it's usually about opinion. This side says this other side says this. And as a researcher, we want to know, are any of these opinions supported? And in particular, we want to know what are the effects when school administrators, whether they are superintendents or principals or school committee members or even state legislators that make educational decisions, when they make educational decisions, they usually look at the research findings, at least the good administrators do. If they're picking a math curriculum, they want to know which one produces the best results, and they look at research. And so we want people to, especially educational decision makers, look at the research findings on effects in particular. And so we summarize them because it's hard to get through all these complicated studies and even find them yourself for other folks to look at. And there's two groups of findings. The first group of findings are direct effects on Native people. Excuse me?
I think there was just some feedback. I think you're good.
Oh, okay. So direct effects on Native people. And basically, Native mascots create a hostile climate for Native youth in the schools. Basically, what they do when you expose Native youth to Native mascots, even Native youth who aren't critical of them, it lowers their self-esteem. It also reduces their ability to perceive future options for themselves. In other words, the ability to imagine future accomplishments. It also lowers the Native youth's opinion about or belief that their Native community can make a difference and make change. In addition, when Native college students were exposed to Native mascots, it increased their stress, it increased their distress, it increased depression, it increased dysphoria, and it increased hostility. And in some cases, like Native people avoid athletic events so they don't have to deal with it. And Native youth who are less critical of the mascots are more affected than Native youth who are critical. The majority of the studies, though, are about the effects of Native mascots on non-Native critical people, and especially whites, but other people as well. And basically the research, there's several findings here that the Native mascots are associated in people's minds in a kind of unconscious way with negative thoughts. And the Native mascots are associated with negative stereotypes of Native Americans. Further, there's some studies that show that exposure to Native mascots increases negative stereotyping of Native Americans. And there's a whole bunch of studies that show that, all in different ways. And lastly, there's a couple studies that even show that exposure to Native mascots increases the chance of discrimination against Native people. And so these are indirect effects on Native people, because if non-Native people don't understand Native reality and they learn from these mascots problematic ideas, or those ideas get reinforced, then that can harm Native Americans, because what the rest of society does affects Native people. In addition, from an educational perspective, why would schools want their youth to be learning stereotypes? Why wouldn't, as Heather said, we want Native youth to learn accurate histories, and also, of course, about contemporary Native people, especially Native tribal nation sovereignty. So I have a lot more to say, but that's the bottom line, that the mascots are not educationally sound because they directly harm Native youth, creating a hostile climate. And they also have negative effects on non-Native people in terms of learning misinformation and the potential that they might unconsciously usually do harm. I have a lot more to say because I've been studying this for over 20 years, but I'm taking my turn.
Super. And just, I'd sent you a picture of the Mayapack mascot, which was a spear, a primitive spear, and that's how the Indian is depicted in the logo. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, let me speak generally and indirectly at your question.
Yeah.
So the Native mascots started to be selected in the late 1800s. And they were selected along with other like animals and other occupations that were associated with violence and fighting. And so it's not surprising that the Native mascots are mostly warriors, right? And they're also kind of all about past Native people, which kind of obscures the existence of contemporary Native people. So they're almost all male, they're almost all warriors. As Heather was implying, they homogenize, there's over 570 different Native tribal nations with all different cultures, and they create this Hollywood version of a sort of stereotype. And so that's why they're selected. And, when you look at the type of animals that are selected, they're also more aggressive animals, not things like bunnies and deer.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Nicholas, you're Native American. You're with the Native American Guardian Association. What are your thoughts about the mascots and the way Native Americans are portrayed? Nick, are you there?
First of all, thank you, David, for allowing me to be on this public discussion forum. I do not look at it as a mascot. I look at it as a symbol. When we say mascot, it's a pretty derogatory term. I look at it as a symbol of honor. There have been studies that have gone against, according to the Washington Post, there was a study that was done that 91% of Native Americans actually approve of these Native American symbols and also approve of these names and images. There have been like the Freiberg study, for example, and actually Stephanie Freiberg did end up going back. Not many people seem to talk about that study, but she ended up going back and having to redo her study, and they pretty much, she goes in there, and the second one she said that she actually supports educating people, and I believe education is key, and you could find all the facts and to actually argue and not harm to actual Native Americans and stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Nick.
So,
Thank you.
not
Thank you. Jackie Keeler, you've been involved in this issue for many years. What are your thoughts about this idea of honoring the Native Americans with these symbols, mascots, etc., on sports teams?
Yeah, so I've written a lot about this issue. I was one of the parents who co-founded Eradicating Offensive Native Mascotry, and we actually created and launched the hashtag Not Your Mascot in 2014 during the Super Bowl. And I've been active on the issue locally, not active, but I've just been participating in the Oregon state's removal of mascots from high schools here, and which was done at more of a state level. But I also would like to speak to so a couple of things that previous folks brought up, and is one is the issue of representation, right? And I actually coined the term mascotry, right? Because often people would say, oh, but the mascot is this prosaic image of a Native American warrior. Aren't you proud of that, right? That's not a bad thing, right? And but it's not the issue is not the mascot. The issue is what they do with it. You know, the red face, the tomahawk chops, and we're talking about stadiums filled sometimes with 90,000 people doing these things, right? And it doesn't stay in one place. I mean, and so it's you can hear it on television. You know, you can hear it all over the place. And so mascotry refers to that, to the actual things they do with it. It's like minstrelsy, you know, like doing blackface, and we do call it red face, right? And so it's quite it does, studies have shown in 2015 the University of Buffalo did a whole review of different studies and found that mascots not only promote stereotypes, but they promote primarily negative ones about Native people, and on top of that, they also are sort of an entry sort of route to other negative stereotypes about other peoples, right? Other ethnic groups, other minority groups, other racial groups as well. And a pluralistic society, it's really not a helpful thing to have going on in, you know, so many high schools. I think the national number is like 2,000 high schools have Native American mascots, and I think it's going down, of course. But but the other issue about, you know, like comparing it to something like the Vikings, right? You often get people asking about the Vikings and things like that. But, you know, that would only be comparable if that was the only way white men were seen. Like, you never saw a white man on television anchoring the evening news. You never saw a white man, you know, saving the world in a Hollywood movie. You never saw a white family on TV in a sitcom, right? You never saw a white man in the White House. You never saw a white man ever. You go into a bookstore and there's thousands of books, and maybe one is written from the perspective of a white man, right, as the main character. And so this is the world that we actually live in, you know. And so what would be the first thing you would ask if you saw that white man, and the only time you ever saw him was as a mascot, as a Viking, right? What would you ask him? You would say, where's your helmet? Where's your horns? Where's your longboat? You know, these are the things you'd be asking him, because this is your only reference point for him. And this is the actual world we live in. Like, I live here in Portland, Oregon. If I went to Powell's bookstore, how many books would be written from the perspective of a Native woman like myself? How many? You know, less than 5, right? If that many at all. And so we live in a place where we are completely marginalized. And I often say that mascots mask our lived realities, right? And with the study, with the Washington Post study, I actually wrote a piece about it in The Nation magazine. And I looked at that study, right? And what I found was a number of interesting things. One was that a number of these studies do not require the person actually prove that they're Native American. So you have this phenomenon, like we saw with Warren, Senator Warren, you know, people saying they're Native, even like her putting it on her, you know, her bar card, right, handwriting it in with no proof that they're Native, right? It's very popular. I mean, I think out of you know, every time I meet a white person, they're like, you're the first Indian I ever met. And then the next thing they say is, well, I have a Cherokee grandmother, right? I would say we could probably say a third of all white people in this country think that they have Native ancestry. So when you look at the study, you will notice some interesting things about it. One is that there is a very high percentage of respondents who are men over the age of 50. Native men have very, very low life expectancies. When my dad was 55, he was the last Indian guy from his high school still alive. You know, you're not going to get a study where a huge portion of the respondents are men over 50, because they're a tiny sliver. Like even the Navajo Nation, where I am enrolled, my mother's tribe, you know, if you look at the demographics, you know, the population, 70% of the population, these are old demographics from 2014, but 70% of the population was under the age of 27. Only 30% were over the age of 30.
Wow. Okay.
So the other issue is that, you know, most of the respondents were from the Deep South. And as you know, the tribes were removed from the Deep South. And so this is just white men answering the phone call, saying they're Indian so they can put their thumb on the scale. So these studies the only one study actually required that someone be Native American and have some identification. And that was one done at California State University, Hayward. And that is not a randomized study, which is why it's not often cited. But I felt the numbers seemed more in line with what I know in the Native community. And it was about 67% were opposed. And then a very small percentage were for it. And then the remainder were undecided. And I think that was a much more accurate reading of what we see going on in our communities, in our families. I mean, I have 50 first cousins who are tribally enrolled, right? None of them support the mascot. It's sort of not a thing, you know? So it's, you know, I think that we need better studies, but people are going to have to actually show that they are enrolled in a tribal nation, right? And they are actually going to have to do that, yeah.
Thank you. Nick, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that. First of all, yes, can you hear me? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay, just make sure. A movement as well as AI do not for all Native Americans. That is just a small portion. Groups like Not Your Mascot and all these other schools, all these other groups in the world here, are actually radically hate-filled movements. They're all politically motivated, and they go into communities. They cause division. They do nothing but just leave the community in uproar instead of offering a solution. So I believe a solution would be education, and that's what the organization supports: educating people. And groups do not speak for the majority of Native Americans.
Thank you, Nick. Dan, you grew up in Mayapack.
I did.
You were an American. You were a Mayapack Indian in high school.
I was.
And you traveled under the banner when you went to school that said "Entering Indian Country."
Correct.
How did you feel about that?
So, great question. First off, thank you for having me here, and thank you for opening up the space for a discussion like this. You know, I never saw this as a problem. I think first and foremost, I never saw this as an issue. I never saw this as controversial. And many of my peers and many members of the Mahopac community don't see this as an issue as well. And no one's read about the research. No one's looked into the issue because it's never been brought up. So I've always felt uncomfortable about it, especially toward the end, toward my senior year. I always felt uncomfortable with some of my peers dressing as Native Americans on the sports field. I always felt uncomfortable with the Entering Indian Country banners that I had to pass by every time I went to school. And I truly never understood what that feeling meant, because it's so normalized in our school that this is our identity. And I say this is our identity, where our community of Mahopac is a 91.1% white community. So it's difficult when I have this feeling, but I don't have a word to understand this by. So it did bother me for a while until I was able to completely understand exactly why I felt this emotion.
And what was the change? How was it that you became involved in this issue in the town here?
Yeah, great question. So in July of last year, I was fortunate enough to jump into a curriculum to get my master's of public health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Johns Hopkins has a Center for American Indian Health. And I had multiple professors that were members of the center, and they were Indigenous themselves. They worked in Indigenous communities as well. And that is where I met Dr. Melissa Walls, who works in Indigenous communities within Minnesota. And she discussed this at length with me. She discussed this feeling, and she discussed this why I felt this kind of inherent shame about being a Mayapack Indian. And she brought me to a whole bunch of different literary sources. She brought me to Dr. Laurel's different pieces of literature. She brought me to Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, and she also introduced me to many of her colleagues as well. So she introduced me to Barbara Munson, who's the president of the Wisconsin Indian Education Association and a member of Oneida Nation. She brought me to Harvey Gunderson and Carol Gunderson, Religious Americans Against Indian Nicknames and Logos. She brought me to Malian Dana, who's the tribal nation ambassador for Penobscot Nation in Maine. And after discussing and after talking with Indigenous people, talking with professors of psychology, of sociology, I was able to understand the subject a little bit more and kind of bring it back to the context of the Mahopac community and understand the shame that I've been feeling, that I never had the opportunity to learn about these tribes. Never had the opportunity in school to really engage with subject matter that was Indigenous. And I felt a whole deal of shame after that. And it was great to dive into that subject matter because I was able to put words to meaning.
Yeah, okay. And what happened when you brought this up to the school district? You had a petition that you put together and had a couple thousand people sign it. And what was the reaction of the school district?
So when I began to compile information and began to read studies, I then wrote an op-ed that was published in the Mahopac News called Retiring or Removing the I from Indian. And in that, I wrote a 3-step plan to retiring an Indigenous mascot. And many times when we see petitions come up, a lot of petitions just want to retire the Indian mascot or retire their Indigenous mascot. But I advocated for educating the community more on Indigenous culture and also including curriculum based on non-colonialist education and Indigenous culture as well. So once I wrote that petition, I was contacted by the district clerk, Melody LaRocca, and I had a meeting with the superintendent in October of 2019. It was just an introductory meeting where we got to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit more about why this mascot was formed in the first place and how we can talk a little bit more and dive into a discussion. So after our meeting ended, we decided that we would have another meeting in the middle of November. And once we got to the middle of November, and we both promised at that meeting that we would bring in the town historian, we would bring in Indigenous people, I would bring in Dr. Melissa Walls and Dr. Melissa Lewis, who also works with the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health, and also some of the other stakeholders and Indigenous community members that I've been talking with as well. And when it came to the middle of November, the meeting was pushed off to December. And when we got to December, the school district had a 3-hour delay because of inclement weather. And that got pushed back to January 11th of 2020. And the day before, I received a message from Melody LaRocca saying that they were no longer interested in pursuing the subject matter and that they brought it up with the Board of Education and they decided that this is a non-starter and they do not want to pursue this any further. And they believe that they're fully honoring without consulting any of the evidence that I plan to proceed with, without consulting with Indigenous people, without consulting with any of those outside and internal bodies that we have within our community as well. And from that point, we continue to advocate, we continue to stress the petition and stress those 3 points that I've been talking about as well. And it's been a non-starter within the community and it's been a non-starter within the Board of Education meetings, and they continue to not want to breach the subject.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Heather, you said you have some thoughts about the banner, the entering Indian country. What are your thoughts about that?
That's interesting to me. It's interesting to me because when that was first brought to my attention, I was completely floored. I think my jaw hit the ground because imagine, and this is for predominantly non-native community, where they've got this banner, and I just want to thank Daniel for being an ally and standing up to that, and coming to it on his own, where he was like, hold on, this doesn't seem right. And having that banner in a predominantly non-native community on ancestral native land for a school mascot seemed really jarring to me. And the first thing that came into my mind, and I would challenge anyone, would be, imagine if we had that over our reservations, at the entrance of our reservations, or if we had that sign in any native community said now entering Indian country, there would be uproar like you wouldn't believe, because somebody would feel like we were infringing on their rights to be able to travel through there. So I just, the banner I find very disheartening.
Well, yeah, because this was your land here. This was.
Yes, this is our ancestral homelands, areas of interest of the Mohican people, and it's insane that you would have a banner that says now entering Indian country where there are no Indians. I mean, not that there aren't any Indians, but it's a predominantly non-native area. So I find that very disheartening.
Yeah. Okay. Nick, you had another comment about the Mayapack situation?
Yes, I would like you actually to Star Dancer made it on here. That would have been off it coming from her. But I'm going to read an email here that she sent to the school board. I'll just go ahead and read it. She says, my family and I are not offended by the Mohopic. She also taught me how to pronounce the name here. Central School District, using the term Mohopic Indians. Name, logo, and symbol. It is an honor. Mohopic is an Algonquin name that is given by the Indians. Algonquin is her native language. She's a Warpinger Native American, along with several other tribes and subtribes that include the Mohopic Indians. The band of the Nakampeem from the Wappinger Confederacy had many subtribes, including Mohopic Native Americans. Her people still live in Putnam and Dutchess County today. She says she never left. We're still here. She's the descendant of Chief Canopus and Sachem Daniel Nahum and Abraham Nahum and Chief Corn Planter and Shaman Isaac Barrett, Henry Barrett, and more. The Wappinger Nakampeem Mohopic Band of Native Americans and other tribes, subtribes were the original inhabitants of Putnam and Dutchess County. I urge you, school board, not to change the term Mohopic Indians. So on here, her family was the original people to settle that area. And I believe for all these people to come in and tell her that how to feel, this is her family. And that's just, would be racist in itself, because you're telling a Native American how they should feel. And I do not believe that you should be able to tell Native people how they should be. And I actually appreciate Star Dancer and her culture and stuff like that. And it was a good conversation. But she is the original descendant of this. I believe we should leave it up to the locals instead of these other people.
Heather, do you have a response to that? I mean, you're from the actual federally recognized tribe.
Correct. And I also retain the Needham name in my family. So it's I don't, again, want to question what anybody, their descendancy or what their opinion is. I respect all opinions, but I just want to say this. When we say Wappinger, we're actually, to clarify, it's Munsee, and which we both are. We are Mohican and we are Munsee. we are the federally recognized tribe that was in that area in Putnam and Dutchess counties. We actually have people in our tribe that retain the Putnam name as well. So that just goes to show that we do have ties to that area. There were, again, just because nations moved doesn't mean that all people moved, but the ones that didn't move didn't retain their tribal sovereignty or their nationhood, because the Wappingers did join with us in 1675 and became part of the Mohican Confederacy. We moved to our new homelands, and if people today identify if Putnam County is having Mohican or Munsee heritage, it's a personal heritage, but that does not constitute a sovereign tribal nation. I'm first line descendant and an enrolled citizen of federally recognized tribal nations that have come out against the use of mascots. And while I fully respect Ms. Star Dancer's opinion on it, absolutely, I would remind her that we are also not just those Indians in Wisconsin, as she was also quoted as saying. We are the original inhabitants of that area.
Yeah. Okay. Dan, what are your thoughts about when you hear from Alicia or what Nick read? There's someone who says that it's a good idea, Native American. You believe that it's not a good thing?
Well, I've spoken with a lot of Indigenous people, and I've spoken with, again, Mally and Dana in particular, and Dr. Melissa Walls about this subject matter. And as somebody that centralizes on public health, and especially on child and adolescent health in particular, the policy created to keep this mascot and based solely off of the research conducted by Dr. Laurel, as well as Dr. Stephanie Freiberg and all of the different researchers, and the American Psychological Association and Sociological Association have shown that this causes harm in particular. So despite there being that opinion within the town, I still pursue research as a high pinnacle of value. And I still see if there is harm to be caused onto minoritized youth, so that's Native youth and any Black, Indigenous people of color, especially within our community, and especially that compete interscholastically with our sports teams as well, because we are influencing the other towns that we come in contact with too. It's very important that we recognize that this causes harm overall to minoritized youth. And I think anytime that we correlate a statement that says harm and youth, we really need to look at what that ultimately means and how we could better policy accordingly.
Laurel, when you've spoken around the country, are these similar issues all around the country that you're hearing on this issue?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I like Dan just emphasized the research, but I want to say something else that's not so research-based. And that is these mascots, the vast, vast majority of these mascots are selected in predominantly white communities, like this community. And so they're selected and they're made like white people come up with these ideas and then they make them. And it's really taking somebody else's identity, like Indian, and culture. And we call this cultural appropriation, right? And it really shouldn't be a decision that is made by non-Native people. It should be a decision made based on the research findings of harm, because that's what education is trying to do. And also, I want to go back to what Heather's saying. It should be Native opinion, but not individual Native people. We have not only over 570 federally recognized Native nations, but we also have the National Congress of American Indians, which is representing the majority of these nations. And so to me, like it just doesn't make any sense morally for some people to use without permission other people's culture and identity. And I was recently on a panel. I was the only white person, and there were 7 Native people that spoke before me. And what was really impressive is that they were all representing federal or state recognized tribes in the state of Massachusetts. And they operated the whole panel, and the people from the high school, were listening. It was in front of the school committee. And these were spokespeople from Native nations, and they came forth and spoke on behalf of their nation. And it was what really should happen. And then that school committee did what they should do, which is listen to the recognized bodies and the position that these bodies have, in addition to the research findings, and not just the opinion of the town.
Yeah. Now, Jackie, you grew up in Oregon, the only Native kid in a high school. What was that like?
Well, I actually grew up in Washington State.
Washington State, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I wanted to speak to the issue of that the pervasiveness of Native mascots in our schools, and how often what people don't realize is that, when I was talking to some of the tribes, like the Celeste tribe here, who have their own Native mascot, right? And I think that is a really different matter, because for one, Native students have other sort of ways of knowing themselves. They're not just a mascot in their own lives. The other thing is that they also control the portrayal, right? And if it's just about their tribe and it's just their tribal language and their regalia, that's their choice, right? When it's more general, like the Braves or something that would actually encompass other Native folks who have no say over that use, then it's a problem. But what people don't realize is that Native students are often the only Native kid in their school. Right. And so you have a situation where you have to educate everyone else about what it is to be Native, and so what you're talking, think about it, if there are 2,000 high schools in this country that have Native American mascots, right? And extrapolate that percentage to the Black community, right? And the Black community it's a little bit more than this, let's say 10 times the size of the Native American community. So you're talking about 20,000 high schools in the United States that would have a Black mascot. And just think about all the craziness that would ensue, and all the extra work that Black parents and Black students would have to do to educate around those stereotypes. And all the energy it takes. One of the things that Laurel, Dr. Davis-Delano noticed was that when they did the study about self-esteem, what they also found was that young people who said beforehand that they were okay with the mascot, they actually experienced the steepest decline in self-esteem after being exposed to a mascot, a Native American mascot. And that my sort of theory about this is that the student has to do all this energy to make it okay. Energy they could be using for other things, like doing well in school, like focusing on their schoolwork. And it's an incredible toll to take just to get an education, right? It's completely, and for the parents, as a parent, you're doing so many things, taking your kids to so many activities. Imagine having to, on top of that, educate 1,000 other parents, who know nothing about Native people except stereotypes. And stereotypes, Native people have real concerns. We have issues like, as you've seen with the COVID coverage, I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. We have a population of 370,000 citizens, the population of Iceland, right? We have the land base of the Republic of Ireland. We're larger than 22 member states of the UN. Did you know that by learning about mascots? No. It masks our actual realities and our actual concerns. The Navajo Nation has real concerns that need to be addressed, not mascotry. And so I think that the level of sort of the burden that mascotry places on, the mascotted, right? And it's an act that's done to us, and it happens it causes problems even internally. Like a lot of tribes are not being mascotted because that's not their culture being mascotted. It's my dad's people's culture, the Lakota and Dakota people's culture, Plains culture that's being mascotted, right? So like my mother went to a high school on the Navajo Nation, and their mascot was a Plains Indian warrior with a full bonnet, right? And so when they when they changed it, the Tuba City Warriors, when they changed it, when I was a kid, they changed it to a Navajo scout. The Navajos wear their hair in a bun. They wear a scarf around their head, kind of kung fu, kind of kung fu style. They don't wear feathers in their hair. They don't do all that. And the Navajo, that high school was 90% Navajo, right? Like 2% white, 8% Hopi. My mom was just inundated with phone calls from other class graduates, and they were like, the Tuba City Warrior isn't a Navajo scout. He has feathers in his hair. And I saw my dad when he came to the Navajo Nation, that where the stereotypes that Navajos have about Sioux people, are very, they think they're more primitive than Navajos are, because Navajos are more sophisticated or something. It's like we have them about these reinforced stereotypes even between tribes. So it's not a great. We live in a pluralistic society. This is the least we could do, and the studies bear that out.
Yes. Well, thank you all very much. Unfortunately, the school board president from Mayapack, he couldn't log on. We're trying to get him logged on. He could not, which was a shame. We would have loved to have heard his point of view. And if the Mayapack School District is going to join the other school districts in the state of New York, as James was saying, who are engaging in this community discussion. And I want to thank you all for joining in this evening. It was a great discussion we had. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Dan, Heather, Laurel, and Jackie. It was a great discussion. And thanks. And good night.
Good night.